Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the announcement of the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation's Collections Strategy, Broadening Narratives. I'm Clover Morell. I'm the Program Associate for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation in the Chicago office, or now from my home in Evanston. The presentation today is going to be about 40 minutes long. Some of it is pre-recorded to reduce technical issues, we hope. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A, which will last for about 30 minutes. Please feel free, if you have any questions while you're watching the presentation, to put them in the Q&A, which you will find the icon for at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. After the event is over, we will place the recording and the guidelines for the new strategy up on the website as soon as possible. If you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to drop a line in the chat. That will reach all of us, the panelists. Aside from that, chat has been disabled, as have your videos, and everyone, of course, is on mute. At the end, I will present your questions to Ellen, Carrie, and David. And for now, I'm going to pass it on to David Farron. Thank you all so much for being here.
Director of the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation. We're very excited to have all of you here joining us for the launch of our new collection strategy, Broadening Narratives. Most of you know the foundation, but very, very quickly, we're a 65-year-old family foundation, place-based in Chicago and the Lowcountry of South Carolina. Collections has been a mission area of the foundation as long as we've existed, going back to Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly's love of books and all things cultural. The work of the foundation has always related to our two mission regions and is now deeply embedded in the family legacy as we've moved on to the second and third generations. Especially now, this field is changing in very exciting and dynamic ways. So let me talk a little bit about the process. We started 2 years ago working with a team of consultants, Randy Korn and Associates and Slover Lynette. And so the first step was casting a broad net, doing some interviews with collecting organizations in each of our regions and also across the country to learn about emerging trends and issues. We then held a collective brainstorming session in Chicago with about 24 people, including leaders of organizations that we've supported, our staff, and several members of our board. Along the way, we've been in close communication with 5 advisory groups. These are grantees of the foundation that serve as the primary membership affinity groups for the field in our 2 regions and really help us really as our eyes and ears to extend our reach. These groups have been amazing, just great partners, helping us think through what we're learning and to ultimately translate this into the new strategy, again, broadening narratives. We hope that event will be informative and that you will be in touch with our team to explore opportunities for us to collaborate. Thank you again.
Hello, I'm Brian Bannon, a member of the board of the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, and been thrilled to be a part of this process and a member of the board for some time. A little bit about me is I'm a career librarian. I currently am the Maryland James Tisch Director at the New York Public Library, and in that capacity lead the circulating libraries as well as our education work. Prior to that, I was the CEO and commissioner of the Chicago Public Library in San Francisco and Seattle before that. So I spent my career working in public libraries and know them as collecting institutions. And as a board member of the foundation, it was wonderful to be a part of this collaborative process along with the other board members to really take a moment to reflect on the importance of collections and to perhaps rethink the role that the foundation has in supporting collecting institutions and the creation of new narratives about the ideas in which those collections represent and reflect. Collecting institutions like libraries and museums are essential to capturing our history and deepening our understanding around the world. And I think what we really strive to do with this new strategy is to better incent and encourage our collecting institutions, not just to collect the materials, but to work with communities themselves to bring those materials to life and to share the new insights that our communities have about what those collections mean and the new ideas and narratives that they can bring forward. And so this new strategy really is about that. It's working with our institutions, our communities directly to help build our collections and to help bring out those important narratives that describe and hopefully educate us on our world today and our world in the past and hopefully where we go in the future. This work we think is essential to our foundation. The work of collections has been a long time focus of the foundation, and this new strategy reflects not only the importance of collections, but the importance of us to continue to push ourselves to think differently around how we perform our mission as a foundation in this area. And it will hopefully help us create a fuller understanding or support a fuller understanding of our priority areas in the Lowcountry and in Chicago through our partnerships with the institutions. So in short, we look forward to learning together and with you as we go on this journey. And this is, again, a long journey that we've been on for some time, and this is yet the next evolution, and we think an important one, and we're glad to be finally launching it. So thank you.
What do we gain from sharing our stories?
The Japanese community in Chicago grew quickly in 1940s when 20,000 people of Japanese ancestry were released from the World War II incarceration. I never understood the heartache and injustice that they endured. And yet they managed to build community and rebuild their lives. Our neighbors, our schools, our city didn't know their stories or their history either.
And this story resonated with me deeply because if there's anything I've learned is you must push through. You have to look within and figure out what your journey is about and have faith in yourself and the people who have helped you through.
You know, in the past, long ago, one generation told stories to the next generation, and that's how our culture and our narrative came down. The Donnellys' Broadening the Narrative program allowed us to do something that no one had ever done before by documenting South Carolina's LGBTQ community.
The documentation of our own culture through storytelling becomes the American experience and strengthens the broader fabric of society in which we all live in.
These stories connect us to our past, help us understand our present, and may guide us into the future.
And at the end of the day, that's the whole point. We all want to be heard, we all want to be understood.
That's what this Broadening the Narrative project is allowing our community to do right now.
When we learn from other points of view, we get a deeper understanding of the complexity of our world and its possibilities. We gain history, we gain culture, and we gain connection. Let's broaden the narrative.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Forrest. I'm the Lowcountry Program Director for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelley Foundation. Welcome to our launch event today to talk about our new strategy, Broadening Narratives. Joined by my colleague in Chicago, Ellen Wadey. Ellen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Wadey. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Arts and Collections up here in Chicago for the Donnelley Foundation.
Fantastic. And we are also joined this morning by two of the members of our collections umbrella group that has helped us do a lot of the research over the past couple of years that went into developing this new strategy. So I'd like to welcome John White from the College of Charleston and Marcia Walker McWilliams from the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. And they're going to talk with us this morning and give you all a little bit of an insight into how this new strategy was developed. So I want to give John and Marcia an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the work that they do at their respective institutions. And I'll start with John. Oh, John, you're on mute. There you go.
Let's start over again. Hi, I'm John White. I am the Dean of Libraries at the College of Charleston. I was previously the founding director of the Lowcountry Digital Library, and I'm also a co-director of the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative.
Fantastic. And Marcia?
Good morning. I'm Marcia Walker McWilliams, the Executive Director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, or BMRC for short. And we are a consortium of libraries, universities, museums, community, and arts organizations, all of which have materials related to the Black history and culture of Chicago.
Fantastic. Well, I want to start this conversation with a question to both of you, because as I mentioned, we've been looking at this and studying this for a couple of years now. And really the collections field has evolved a great deal over the last couple of years. I would love to get your thoughts briefly on just how you've seen the shift in the collecting field. Marcia?
Sure. In terms of shifts in the collecting field, I think one of the key shifts has been around the area of sort of description of collection and access to collections. Certainly within the past couple of years, the concept of kind of critical cataloging and the description and how you actually describe collections has been really important, especially in relation to marginalized groups who may not have always had a role in how they are described or sort of portrayed in collections. So I've seen that as a really interesting phenomenon that's happening, and one that has led to more collaboration between community groups and marginalized groups with sort of collecting personnel.
Fantastic. And John, your thoughts on how the field's evolved?
Well, I think one of the big points of emphasis has been for archivists, librarians, museum professionals to use their skills from their profession, not solely for the goal of accumulating materials for their home institution, but in providing access in a more inclusive way to archival materials. So for example, if you take the issues that Marcia was talking about being more inclusive and closing what archivists would call archival silences, these whole gaps in collections, that's part of the solution. But another part is sort of post-custodial archives, where archivists and librarians are working to allow community groups and others to hold their own collections and tell their own stories. And this goes sort of back into the way that we're describing them, but it also is impacting the way that we collect. Libraries and archives aren't simply trying to sort of gobble up everybody's materials to provide access to them. They're instead focusing on providing that access in an inclusive way that maintains some of the provenance in these organizations that you created the materials to begin with.
And Marcia, how does this then change the way that the public interacts with these materials and what the public wants to see from museums and libraries in terms of how collections are presented to them?
Sure, I think representation has been key. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen sort of coming out of the museum and library field is that marginalized communities have not always felt represented within the collections or within the materials that are visible to them. And so representation has become more and more important as a result of that. Some of these sort of articles and pieces coming out of the social protest movement has been about the representation of communities of color and marginalized communities in arts museums, in history museums, and cultural organizations as well. And so that has been really important to think about this aspect of representation. I also think a key demand around museums and libraries are spaces for dialogue and engagement. So not just that we are representing new communities or marginalized communities through materials, but that there are actual opportunities to engage, right, with the archivists, with the curators, but also with scholars and members of the general public around what these objects actually mean and what their significance is, especially, when we're sort of dealing with the world that we're dealing with today.
Ellen?
I think one of the other things that we're all kind of interested in too is how this, it's both how the museums and libraries and collecting institutions interact with the public, but how the public themselves are interacting with those organizations, those institutions. And if there's anything that's changing about that. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, part of having, a more inclusive and more dialogue-driven archive involves, essentially thinking of libraries and archives as communities and expanding the definition of who is and is not a member of that community, so that there are sort of more voices involved in the process. And this has impacted everything from how we collect to what we collect to the cataloging and public programming and outreach. All of these things are incredibly important. And what's amazing to a lot of people is it's very easy to assume that, say, we know everything about what, Eliza Lucas Pinckney was doing on a plantation in South Carolina. And we understand that the people who worked the land, the people who actually had some of the, ingenuity and ideas that, their lives were not documented as well. But I think one of the frustrations is that seems to have continued right up into the present. So in order to really make sure that we're being more inclusive, that we are, bringing marginalized groups into the conversation, we also have to sort of expand what it means to be an archive. Who is included in that community, and it can't simply be the sort of gatekeeper role of an archivist or librarian or museum professional going around curating materials that belong to others without including those others in the conversation about what's important and why it's important and how it should be described.
That's great. Marcia, and also looking at this, how are collecting organizations rethinking their direct relationships with audiences?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of thinking going into sort of direct relationship with audiences. And of course, now sort of in the context of COVID-19, there's the concern of how to actually get digital exhibitions or primary source materials to audiences to be able to kind of open up those channels of engagement and collaboration. I also think that there's more of a kind of growing relationship with sort of public programming and also seeing audiences as sources of information, and really sort of inviting folks to see exhibitions, to see discussions and public programming as ways in which they can impart some of their knowledge about events, people, places, and documents, because often audiences also have knowledge in some of the ways that John was speaking to. It's really important to kind of capture that community-based knowledge of the events and narratives that are being collected within the archival repositories.
Great. So again, another question for both of you as we've been talking about this, and you've touched on it a little bit, but why is this strategy of broadening narratives relevant now to the collecting organizations in these two regions? John?
Well, I think that the ultimate goal of this is to essentially accomplish the goal that archives and museums are supposed to accomplish in the first place, which is to capture the history, the culture of the region, to tell a complete and comprehensive story. And in order to do that, we really have to open our eyes to what it means to be part of these larger communities, how they overlap, how they intersect, and their impact sort of on the region. I mean, historically, it's been very easy from everything from a development perspective, just right down to the people who had access to the materials to create these documents and records, to take the easy route, the important families with the important materials that typically came with important donations to care for those important materials. And, we know, and we have, at this point, a few hundred years of evidence that leaves many people out and doesn't tell that complete comprehensive story. So, the direction that we're moving with this program is incredibly important because it not only prioritizes being more inclusive and broadening our perspective of what we collect and who we collect it from and who gets to tell that story, but it also provides resources to do the work, which is incredibly important.
Marcia, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think John brought up a great point that this provides an opportunity for collecting organizations to focus on some of those collections that have been under-resourced in these areas, which all too often, unfortunately, tend to be collections related to marginalized communities. I also think this broadening narrative strategy is going to be really important for smaller collecting organizations as well, who maybe all of the work that they're doing is about broadening a particular narrative or focusing on a marginalized or sort of under covered community. And I think that this strategy provides some really important and key ways in which they can sort of get the resources that they need, but also enter into the conversation and think about collaborative partnerships with other organizations or with communities that they might not have had the resources to be able to do so.
Great. Well, in terms of, how we're thinking about the strategy, there's a way I think that we're thinking of it as a strategy that has open arms, so that we're looking at organizations, collecting organizations, excuse me, of all different sizes and all different disciplines. So Marcia, I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you see in the field as some of the needs that are particular to small organizations.
Sure. I think in terms of smaller organizations, they are often doing a lot of work, and you might have very small staff, and that staff person is your fundraising person. That staff person is your curator. They are the person taking in donations. They are the person managing and building community relationships. They are your PR person. They are the kind of one-stop shop. And you also have a large number of volunteers as well who are doing an extreme amount of work in smaller organizations. And so I think one of the key needs is sort of capacity building. How is it possible to sort of increase the resources for those smaller organizations in terms of staff, in terms of the capacity of volunteers to meet the needs of the organization? It could be that they have advisory boards or community boards that might also need some resources in terms of building up their capacity regarding collections and supporting those collections. I think as well, there are also needs in terms of professional development as well for smaller organizations, some of which might even include how to enter into funding, right? And how to approach foundations or read a grant strategy and understand how your organization fits into that. I think there are a lot of different needs of the smaller cultural organizations. At the same time, they have a lot of really great resources and benefits, and that they might have increased levels of trust with the communities that they engage in, that they might have more direct relationships with their audiences. And that also provides some really great ways in which they're able to enter into this conversation about broadening narratives and how to do that work that might be instructful for larger organizations or those who are struggling to kind of have the same level of trust and engagement with communities.
Great. And John, how does that then, we've talked about the small collecting organizations, but how are the needs for large museums and libraries different or similar?
Well, in a lot of ways, they're very similar. I mean, the need for professional development, for capacity building, for increasing the resources devoted to this kind of work are always there, even at a large institution. Where I think there are some differences is, sometimes the larger institutions are also the most insular institutions, and it's some of that community building work that a program like this can really assist with in developing that trust in different communities, and again, opening up areas of collecting that historically have either been ignored or there haven't been those inroads into. I mean, the decision to donate grandma's diary to an archive is an incredibly personal one, and it involves an extraordinary amount of trust in that institution that it'll be cared for and used in appropriate ways. So an initiative like this helps to build that larger community of trust, where you can have reasonable conversations about the best way to preserve these materials, to give access to them. And sometimes that is something that a larger institution really can struggle with, because again, there's sort of this big Goliath organization that can be a bit impersonal. So I think it isn't just about sort of expanding skills and capacity building. It's also about, again, broadening these communities of professionals, and then the communities of users, and then having a strong conversation and dialogue amongst all of the stakeholders that you're able to pull together.
And John, this is, I want to make sure that we touch on this, because this is not just about sort of, grandma's diaries and those sort of narratives, but there are all sorts of other narratives that a lot of times when we're talking about collections that we may not readily think of. But I'm, trying to think of some examples of, or how we might encourage science museums or health organizations or others to think about engaging with this strategy.
So one of the things that we discovered with the Race and Social Justice Initiative at the College of Charleston, which is really driven out of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, which is part of the college libraries, is that materials related to racial disparities, for example, are much harder to come by than you would think. That this type of data and information hasn't been collected in the way that most people would assume that it is. It isn't right at your fingertips. It hasn't been curated and made available. There are lots of different kinds of data, whether you're looking at environmental justice or health disparity, food desert information, mapping projects, right down to how cities and highways were designed, that people don't tend to think of as sort of the traditional archival route that we really should start looking at. And this, again, goes to having real conversations with different communities over time. If you speak to, the people who actually live and work in Chicago or the Lowcountry or really anywhere, you'll find that their concerns and what they think is historically important is not necessarily the types of things that archives have traditionally recorded. Even with the South Carolina LGBTQ archive that we were building at the College of Charleston, this involves an awful lot of community building and conversation outside of the university in order to, speak with people in those communities who will tell you what they feel is valid and valuable. It really is about that sort of community building that I think this particular grant program is designed to improve.
Great. Ellen, we covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that we, I know we could probably talk about this topic all day, but anything else that we want to make sure we hit?
I think we've hit the high notes of it all. I think one of the things that's pretty obvious to everyone who's on the call now is why we partner with these advisory groups and how much we learn from them every single time that we meet. So just want to thank John and Marcia for participating today. And every time we talk, I learn something new.
Exactly. Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. It's good seeing you again.
Good seeing you too.
Before we get into the specifics about the strategy, we thought we'd start out with a bit of an overview of the approach that we're taking. And so one of the things that we've really thought about with this is that, we've enjoyed working with museums and libraries over the course of the years and talking about collections, but we also wanted to expand the circle of who's included in that conversation. And we recognize that cultural institutions in communities serve diverse needs, but they also can be places where important archives and collections have been kept. And so we want to include them in the conversation now. And so we're expanding the definition of what a collecting organization is. An organization is going to be eligible to apply as long as collections are a significant part of their mission. So it doesn't need to be their primary focus of their mission. And they also have to have some resources dedicated to their collection, whether that's financial, human resources. They have to be having an ongoing engagement with their collection. As Carrie had talked with John about earlier, the strategy will support museums, libraries, and collecting organizations of all sizes and disciplines. So that includes not only history museums and natural history museums, but science museums, health organizations, art museums. As I said, we want to keep an open arms about that. And the work that we're going to support will include some of the more kind of meat and potatoes of collecting organizations, collections care and digitization, but we also want to expand that as well and have things such as oral histories be part of what we can look at to support through the new strategy. And we also want to recognize that though there are things that overlap between the Chicago metro area and the Lowcountry of South Carolina, that we also have different histories and our cultural institutions are not exactly the same, and we may face different challenges, and each region has its own narrative. So we also want the strategy to be responsive to those differences instead of treating everything as if it were the same. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Carrie to start us off on some of the component pieces of the strategy.
Right. So you'll notice that there are some things about the strategy that are definitely different than the way that we've approached collections in the past, but there are some things that are the same. And I'll start with the project grants. So we will continue to do support for projects primarily related to animating collections with new or expanded lenses for the public. So what that means is that we're looking for that new narrative or the narrative that has not been shared with that collection before, whether it's a collection we've seen and whether it's, as was suggested earlier, maybe looking at how the metadata needs to be expanded, or whether it is really highlighting the stories of a different part of our two regions. I do want to emphasize again that we are looking for organizations of all sizes to apply. John and Marcia spoke earlier about the significance of small cultural organizations, and Ellen just spoke to that as well. We do want smaller organizations to feel comfortable with approaching us for grant funding, and we will work with you to help bring those proposals to life. Another new component of this strategy is we're really looking at capacity building and how do we strengthen organizations in a wide range of needs. So we will be looking to support eligible activities such as professional development in collections care, how to activate collections, what is cultural competency inside of an organization look like, and how do you execute community collaboration, among other things. The grant amounts will be sized according to the organization and how that organization ties the capacity building work in with possible project work in supporting broadening narratives. And then we're also looking at technical assistance and how do we keep collecting organization skills up to date with the changes within the field. So we'll look to support informal coaching. We'll be doing some convening of collecting organizations. We'll be supporting peer-to-peer consulting, as well as some more conference sponsorships, which we've done before, and workshops and other resources will be implemented. So Ellen, you want to talk some about the partnerships?
Sure. So as you met today, the two brilliant leaders of two of our 5 advisory groups, John from the College of Charleston and Marcia from the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. We've been working with 5 groups over the last couple of years to help us develop this strategy, and they're a really important resource from us in terms of giving us information about some of the things that are going on in the field, challenges that are happening, new trends. And it's been, really wonderful to work with all of them. And I did want to mention that we have 3 other partners, which include the Southeastern Museums Conference, the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and the Chicago Collections Consortium. As part of this new strategy, we're going to continue those partnerships. And those advisory groups will also be eligible to apply for project support in addition to the information and the feedback that they give us that's so valuable. Another thing that's really important to the Donnelly Foundation is advocacy, because we really believe that if we can amplify voices, we can bring attention to where it's needed. And so as part of the ongoing strategy, the foundation will regularly meet with funding colleagues in both regions and nationally to promote the value of broadening narratives through collections and to report on the progress of the strategy. We're already finding that people are very interested in the strategy, and we want to be in a learning circle and in information sharing with those of our colleagues who are also funding in this area. Our hope is to encourage more funding for collections and diverse narratives, as well as to generate some collaborative projects with other funders. On the other side of the table, We also realize that there are decision makers at institutions where these collections are being held, and we want to reach out to them and encourage them to embrace new and broadened narratives and to consider additional public users beyond students and researchers so that we really can get the public engaging with these important narratives that all of you will be developing. I'm going to kick it back to Carrie to talk about a couple other pieces of the strategy that we hope to bring online a little bit down the line.
Right. So as you have probably guessed, we see these strategies as evolving as we continue to learn from the field. Two of the things that we've learned about in our research over the last couple of years that we will be hopefully implementing over time are looking at how we can encourage more collaboration across organizations, particularly looking for that cross-pollination of initiatives that help expand diverse narratives. Is there a way to look at how both of these regions, given their differences in the types of collecting organizations in terms of size and number, is there a way to share resources both inter-regionally and across regions to be able to tell more broadened stories? Also, there may be some partnerships between larger collecting institutions and smaller collecting institutions. So we realize that that sort of collaborative work and convening work takes time, but we do look forward to hopefully fostering some of those collaborative efforts in the future. The other piece of this that we're really excited to delve into is that we recognize and have heard from a number of different organizations and affiliate groups the need for museums and libraries to have pathways to diverse staff leadership. And so as our strategy continues to evolve, we hope to be able to include things such as paid internships and fellowships for African Americans, Indigenous people, and other emerging leaders of color at any size institution within our two regions. So we will be continuing to look for ways that we can help innovate with the field and to move forward with the field as it evolves. But Ellen, why don't we talk a little bit about what we think are going to be some of the outcomes from this new strategy?
Sure. And, you know, as you said, this will be an evolving list because it's an evolving strategy, but these are some of the things that we really thought about in terms of what do we hope will be the outcomes of this work, of this new strategy. So one, we hope that the broader range of voices represented in collections will promote a greater understanding of their value to a wider range of audiences and communities. We are strong believers in collections and their impact in terms of how we understand ourselves, and we're hoping that more people will be engaged by these broader narratives. We're also interested, as we've said, we've expanded the definition of collecting organizations, that we receive an increased variety of applicants in collections projects, and that includes those that are taking risks. If you have a project that is a little outside your comfort zone or what has been your comfort zone, you know, please reach out to us and let's talk about it. We really hope to provide greater operational capacity to activate collections. And we know sometimes capacity can really be that sticking point in terms of working with a particular collection. We are hoping for a greater diversity of voices at collecting organizations. We know it's not only important about the voices represented in collections, but it's important about the diversity of people and voices that are working with those collections. Ultimately, we hope for a stronger, more collaborative field. We have a firm belief that when we work together, we're stronger than if we work alone. And one of the things that's very important to us here at Donnelly is to build mutual trust between the organizations with whom we work and with us. And so that's an outcome that we're really focusing on as well. So it all comes down to, there are the components, but I'm sure you're all thinking, so when's the deadline? And the first deadline for this strategy will be Friday, March 26th of 2021. So March 26th of next year. One of the things I did want to bring to attention is that, so you'll have access to see a form of the application, and that will be up on the website probably just after the beginning of the year. But we really want to talk with you before you submit the application. That's important to us because we can ask questions, you can ask us questions, and we really want to make sure that if you have a project that you think is a fit that we really talk it through and make sure it's a fit, that it has potential before you put all that hard work into putting a grant application. So I would say, you know, from now on, if you want to reach out to Carrie and myself, we are very open to those calls, and we'll set up a time and we'll chat through the projects that you're thinking about. And then the guidelines for this strategy go live today, and those are on our website, which is www.gddf.org. And that will, again, kind of recap some of the things that we've talked about today and provide some other guidelines as well. So with that, we are through the presentation portion of this webinar, and we are going to stop and open it up for questions.
Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat if that's easier for you. That works as well. We already have a couple of questions coming in. Do the smaller organizations need to be 501c3 organizations and have the ability to be fiscal agents?
That's a great question, Harlan. And thanks everyone for hanging in with us. We know that this has been, we've moved through a lot of information in the last 40 minutes or so. So we appreciate everyone being here today. Harlan, we do look at fiscally sponsored organizations as well as 501c3s. We'd want to talk with the organization a little bit more just to make sure that we understand the nature of the fiscal sponsorship that they're coming through.
Okay, from Chris Seegars, can an organization submit more than one application?
I'll take this one. Thanks for your question, Chris. What we like to do is one at a time. So I would say if there's a couple of ideas that you have and you're trying to figure out which is the best one to come forward with, that's one of the reasons why we like to have conversations, is just give us a call. We can talk through that, see which one we feel would be the one to move forward first. But we have had ongoing relationships with organizations. So once a project is completed, you know, you're more than welcome to come in again with another project.
From Jamie Kelly, question about partnering with underrepresented diasporic communities in the Chicago area when the collections come from a place of origin outside of Chicago. For example, would the strategy support working with the Filipinx American community in Chicago on collections from the Philippines?
That's a great question, and I think it further illustrates, I think, the mantra of please reach out to our program officers and discuss your proposal, because it really could come down to connection to the regions and what already exists in the region related to this, and a variety of other factors. So it really is it's really gonna depend on a lot of factors, but we are a place-based foundation, and our grant making relates to the two regions, and this strategy in particular around connection to expanding narratives related to the two regions.
Will you be offering multi-year grants with this strategy? From Colleen McGaw, excuse me, I'm not gonna be able to, I'm gonna slaughter that, McGawkey.
You know, we have offered multi-year grants before. Again, a lot of it depends on the, you know, what is the project that you're bringing forward. Typically what we've done in the past is kind of phase projects, so that if there's like a first phase of a project that makes sense, and, you know, kind of get through that phase to then, you know, set it up for the next phase, we've kind of sequenced them that way. Occasionally we do multi-year that are just, you know, kind of straightforward multi-year grants. This is, you know, really with the strategy, it is new. We have figured out a lot of things, but we also didn't want to lock it down so much so that we couldn't be responsive and flexible in terms of what the field needs and, you know, the creative ideas that are out there. So, you know, it's, I'm not trying to dodge anything or make it seem like we don't have this figured out, but we're just trying to really take it project by project and do the best collaborative work with folks that we can.
Great. Next is our institution is planning to open in early 2022, but we're already building our permanent exhibitions and collections. Would we still be eligible?
I'll take this one. I think that with the plan to open and the opportunity to potentially collaborate with a new institution, I don't see why we wouldn't want to have the conversation and see if it's a fit.
Great. How many application cycles will you have each year going forward?
Oh, I'll grab this one. We have 2 application cycles per year. There is, as we mentioned in the presentation, a March deadline for our July cycle or July board decision. And then there is a deadline in late July for the November cycle. But as was mentioned in the presentation, the application will be available first of the year, but we do encourage, I think I'm answering a second question now while I'm at it, that we do encourage that you go ahead and reach out to us now to begin talking through what your project ideas are.
I'll just add quickly, we found that even under our previous strategy, it typically takes a few months of back and forth with the prospective proposal to flesh it out and hone it and come to a joint sense of what we would take to the board. So 4 months out is by no means too early. 6 months out is even better.
I'd just add to that for those grant writers out there, development people, if you go to our website and you're looking for a link to begin filling out the application, our process is a little bit different. We really start with the conversation with the phone call. And at that point, we kind of talk it through till we think it's ready to come in with an application. And then we send you a link to fill out the application. So if you're searching the website and you don't find it, it's not because you missed it. It's just because we have a little bit different of a process. Over, you're on mute.
Yep. Can an ongoing project qualify for support? We are already doing work in this direction. Do the grants need to be for new initiatives, or would an expansion of current initiatives be considered?
John, that's a great question. And I think, again, this goes back to having the conversations with us on the staff about the nature of the project. But I would say it's not automatically disqualified because it's an ongoing project. Let's talk about the ways in which that project's being expanded.
The one thing I want to bring up is just, excuse me, as part of the components of all of this, is we're also looking at how collections connect with the public. So for any project that you're thinking about, talking with us about, or bringing in with an application, is to really be thinking through, even if it's at an early stage and it's not quite ready for public debut, is ultimately we're interested in how does this get to the point where the public can engage with it. So that's something I would just recommend that you focus on.
Great. Next we have from Chelsea. For an entirely volunteer-run organization, is there funding to bring on a full-time staff dedicated to this work?
Chelsea, you're hitting us at a point where we are doing capacity building work, and we do understand that staffing is a big part of capacity. We are leaving that, as I said, kind of flexible and responsive at this point, because we want to see where's the need, how can we fill that need. It's the reality of foundations. We have a limited amount of dollars. How can we do the best work and create the most impact with the dollars that we have? I think it's something we can talk about, but we'd also want institutions. There are many small institutions that are primarily run by volunteers. That's just kind of, unfortunately, the nature of the landscape. And so we need to understand how this ultimately gets that organization to a place where it can sustain that salary on its own. So those are the kind of conversations that we would have around that.
Great. From an anonymous attendee, for South Carolina-based projects, do projects need to be 100% Lowcountry focused, or can the project be statewide but include the Lowcountry? For example, a Native American collection project that covers many tribes, including those in the Lowcountry.
And I think that question actually ties in well with the question right behind it from Alice Taylor Colbert, about continuing the focus on Lowcountry collections or considering the interactions of cultures such as Indigenous people, trade relationships in the 1700s and 1800s. So our collections work is regionally focused on the Lowcountry. Again, definitely worth having a conversation to understand how that project connects the Lowcountry with the rest of the state and what you've got planned. So I would suggest giving us a call so we can talk about it a little bit further.
Harry, I also think that question, raises the issue of collaboration with other foundations. So, for example, if it were a statewide project, one of the factors we'd be looking at is who are the other funders that might be rounding out the funding pie.
Okay, from Lisa, can you talk a bit about developing collections? In other words, if we have many artifacts on a particular topic that aren't exactly curated and a full collection yet, but we have access through our constituents to artifacts we could acquire to enrich our own and develop and curate a very significant collection, would that type of project be considered?
Lisa, I'll start the answer on this one, but David and Ellen, if you want to jump in, I would say this is very similar to the collection that the College of Charleston is doing with LGBTQ that Harlan spoke about in the video, where there was an opportunity, understanding that this sort of history had not been collected in the Lowcountry to date, to be able to create a collection and gather those materials. So as you'll hear us say repeatedly today, give us a call, please call us and let's discuss what the nature of the collection is and whether this is bringing a previously not well-focused story into the public realm, and we can discuss how we might be able to work with you on bringing that forward.
Yeah, I would add to that, one of the things we are really interested in is organizations that are working with communities. And we also understand that that process can be very idiosyncratic. It can be a matter of conversations and negotiation. And so I will say, we're excited and interested about that. That isn't something that's going to make us back off. But, also thinking that through, most of the projects end up being very different from each other. Sometimes it's data mining, so that part of the collection comes to the organization. Some of it stays with the community members. We've got some experience in that. So again, that's where the collaboration really happens. We can talk with you about what we've learned through projects that we've funded in the past, and you can talk with us about the specifics of your project. And together, hopefully we can find a path.
Great. Okay, from an anonymous attendee, are there two funding categories, one for capacity building and one for projects that focus on sharing the narratives of specific items or sub-collections? And if they're not separated, how do you foresee addressing broad capacity building through specific projects?
It's a complex algebra equation. We've kind of roughed out what we think, in terms of the funds that we have, like how we think we'll spend them. Again, we're keeping that flexible depending on, what the field needs and what the organizations that are coming to us need. In terms of a particular project that helps build capacity, that sounds like something interesting. Would be interested to hear then how, after the project is done, that capacity stays in place, because that's, for us, that's really where we're interested in the capacity, is how we help to create incremental steps that can be maintained and baked into an organization so that they can continue to build from there. So I think it's a case of just, really looking how, if it's a project that's going to do that, then how does that capacity stay put so that the next project you do can build on that.
I'm going to combine two of these questions, Eden and Dwight. During the presentation, you mentioned paid internship being part of the future plans for funding. If that's of interest to my organization, should we wait until a later cycle? And from Dwight, how might you help us access excellent interns?
So we are not planning to launch that piece of the strategy right away. So I would say circle back, if you would, please, next year, and we can see how that piece of the strategy is developing. We are also happy to share ideas around possible networks that you can tap into for finding people. So we've mentioned our 5 advisory umbrella groups across the 2 regions, and then other funders that that sponsor internships and fellowships, and other affinity groups and associations in the field.
And I would just also add to that, in terms of internships and fellowships, that does come under our Building the Field initiative. And so we really are looking for underrepresented voices and people who are not as engaged in the collecting industry at this point, or collecting arena. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
We have a few questions about the range of grants. How many do we anticipate making, and what's the award amount range?
I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record this morning, that it's flexible. It really depends on the size of the institution. It depends on how big of a need it is. We don't have this size grant goes to this size organization or this size institution. It all is really developed in conversation. We look and see, sometimes it might be that it's a project that we fund fully. Another time we might see the opportunity that it could help introduce an organization to another funder or to other sources of revenue. So we might issue it as a challenge grant. It really is very specialized and very individual responsive in terms of the way that we think about this and we talk it through.
Great.
The only thing I might add to that, though, is that typically, and as Ellen's already said, that this is very much relational to the size of the organization. But when we're looking at the project grants, typically for a large project, I don't think we're looking at, we capped around $100,000 for particularly large projects.
Is there a matching requirement?
No, there's no matching requirement, although we really do like, when possible, to be collaborating with other funders.
Yeah, it's not a requirement, but it is something that we've done. It's kind of part of the mix.
And I'll just go back real quickly to the previous question. Looking at the history, our grants have, we don't have a quota per se for each of the 2 regions, but we've typically done between 6 and 12 grants per cycle. And then our past approach, in order to spread out our resources, the larger grants, as Carrie said, have been say $100,000 a year over 2 years. Smaller grants might be in the $15,000 to $30,000 range. So it's I think we're anticipating that we're going to stay in that ballpark, but we don't want to lock ourselves in and be able to learn as we go.
So one other thing I would add is if you are a very small organization and we've had very, modest size requests. We don't have a lower end to our requests either. If there's something that $5,000 can help you do, and it can be important to you, we totally want to talk to you about that.
Do you have a strategy for reaching the smaller institutions outside of urban areas that may be run by volunteers or part-timers who are not aware of GDDF and possible resources?
Thanks for the question, Virginia. I'll answer try to answer broadly, but also talk more specifically to the Lowcountry. The 5 umbrella organizations that we're working with across the 2 regions are also primarily helping us as the conduit to those smaller groups as well. So here in the Lowcountry with the College of Charleston, particularly Lowcountry Digital Library, and then with the Southeastern Museums Conference. But we've also been reaching out to a number of the other affinity organizations here in South Carolina, like the South Carolina Federation of Museums, as well as reaching out with some of the other agencies. And Virginia, as you know, sort of also going door to door to talk to organizations. So we're also hoping that, those of you who are participating in the call today will also help us get the word out about this new strategy. We know that we don't necessarily know all of the collecting institutions in our sphere, but we're definitely open to learning about new organizations and hope that groups feel free to give us a call.
Okay, from Kathy, can a smaller organization focus primarily with sharing oral narratives about plantation life for the enslaved partner with a museum on a collaborative project for the application?
Kathy, I think that sounds like that is right in line of what we are talking about with some of the collaborations. Would love to hear more about that project. But yes, we definitely want to see collaborations, particularly between larger and smaller organizations to be able to bring these stories to light. We have been doing some oral history, or we have supported some oral history projects at Coastal Carolina University last year, and also with the LGBTQ project at the College of Charleston. So it is something that we're open to.
And must we have our own collection, or can we receive support for aggregating material from other collections and providing the general public with a new perspective?
So the collection, the organization must have collections as part of its programming or its program work. But Tom, I know we've talked about some of the work that you all are doing. Partnering, there would be an opportunity, I think, if you were partnering with another a collecting institution to help bring those stories forward.
With the pandemic, we are often in new territory with outreach and et cetera, and even hiring new workers. Have there been discussions on how this can impact our programs and how changes might have to be made during projects?
Yeah, we've been being very plugged in and attentive to the challenges that are happening in the arts and culture field right now. We know it's been overwhelming and that every day presents something new. So again, we're trying to be responsive to it. We know that 2021 is probably going to look very different than 2022 and on. When we started thinking about this collection strategy, there was no idea that something like what has happened with COVID-19 would be happening in the world. We decided to move ahead with it in consultation with our advisory groups, because they really urged us that to have something hopeful, to have something to look forward to have something to plan for. So we are moving ahead and we're excited about it, but we are very cognizant that this is a challenging time. And so we're completely open to working with folks about what museums and libraries look like and other collecting organizations in the time of COVID.
And yes, I can answer the last question. Then for the National Indo-American Museum, we will be making a recording of this webinar available on our website as soon as possible, and the guidelines will be up today.
Great. And Clover, I just noticed that we have gotten a couple of other things in the chat box.
Wonderful. Let's move over to the chat.
So I just want to make sure that we cover those if we haven't already before we sign off.
How do you define a small organization?
Yeah, it's not a hard and fast rubric. I think, you know, of course, you're always looking at things like budget size, but we're also looking at things like small organizations tend to have either very small staff or volunteer staff. It's something that we bring over from our other mission areas, is that, you know, there may be some foundations that don't work with really small organizations. We do. We will go all the way down to the smallest of the small organizations in terms of having a conversation and seeing if there's a way that we can help and partner. In terms of the top side of a small organization, you know, that there's different approaches to that. It tends to be when you're under, you know, you're around $1 or $2 million, then you get into kind of closer to a mid-size. Of course, there's giant museums with multi-million-dollar budgets. But if the concern is about, are we too small? Don't worry, you're not.
From the same person, from Kay, we are collecting Chicago Korean immigration related items and stories. Can I say this is a collection project?
If it's an oral history project, Kay, we've actually supported some oral history projects in the past. So that is something that we're interested in. We have supported a project with the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance. We've supported a project with the Indo-American National Museum. And in both cases, they were collecting the oral histories of particularly elders in their community who had, in the case of the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance, migrated in terms of the Indo-American immigrated to Chicago. And they wanted to make sure that they had those stories as part of their history in the city. You know, I think in terms of any stories that are coming from another geography and coming to Chicago, we're interested in them. We are particularly interested in how those stories relate to, and the same thing would be true of the Lowcountry, how they help shape the region that we're in, how they became part of the story of this place. So those are the things that we're really focused on, but definitely oral histories are part of it.
And I think for a project like that, just to add on quickly, I think we would want to understand how those collected oral histories would be made available to a larger public. So it's not that it's not a project that would stay within a small circle, but that it would become available for part of expanding narratives in our two regions.
Great. Those are all of the questions that we have, I believe. So it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for being here today.
And before we close out, we do want to give you all our contact information, but David, do you want to bring us home?
Sure. So I just want to say how gratifying it is that we had so many people join us, that there's this level of interest in our new strategy around expanding narratives. I think we had over 100 people on the webinar today. So thank you so much for joining us. As you can tell from our staff, we're just very excited about this. We're very excited to be collaborating with you. And we believe very strongly in the important role that museums and libraries play in terms of being trusted messengers in these times with social justice issues, public health issues, issues around the environment. There are no more trusted messengers than museums and libraries. So we take this as a very important collaboration, and thanks again for taking the time to join us.
Great. Thank you all.